All right, good morning and welcome to Studio Time with Deb. This is the online version. Today what we're going to talk about is setting tiny cabochon stones, the ones that give you heartburn when you look at them because they're so little. So it was an interesting week. So I've had several students ask me about setting tiny stones, and in figuring out how to set tiny stones, it reminded me why I really love teaching. And one of the reasons I do is because you guys ask hard questions, questions that I don't know the answer to. So I have to go play and I have to experiment. It gives me an excuse to get in the studio and do things that I probably would not do on my own. And a chance to push myself a little bit to see what's up. So sometimes it's something I can end up integrating into my work. And often it's just that I learned something technical from it. So this was kind of both of those. I may integrate them into my work. I'll tell you my conclusions to my experiments that I'll show you. But definitely I learned some technical information that I think is really interesting. So I'll walk you through that as well. So after several students asked about setting tiny stones, I went through my stones and I found a small pile of 3mm rose quartz cabochons. I don't love rose quartz anyway. So, and the 3mm ones are just so tiny. And I probably had these 20 years. And so I looked at them and I said, you are going to be my experiment. I'm going to play with you. So what I decided to do was to try a whole bunch of different settings. And I'm going to talk to you about that. Right now, I'm going to screen share the slides. So the very first thing that you have to do is that you have to look at your stone and figure out how tall your bezel needs to be. Now, you need to remember that if this is a 3mm stone, this is about 1/4 to 1/2 of a millimeter high. So we are not dealing with a large bezel here. Even the tallest one would be maybe 1 millimeter tall. So we are dealing with tiny bezels. Making a tiny bezel is painful. So you got to look at the profile. You got to figure out about how high that needs to be. And the next thing that you do is you need to measure your stone. You need to measure across the bottom. You need to measure across the top. You need to see where you're going to go with this. And then what I did was to dream up the possibilities. So all of my stones were pretty close to 3mm. So then I sat down and I started dreaming up possibilities. What are possible ways to set this? I can use a bezel cup. They're commercially available. I can use round tubing and cut it off to the right height and then put the stone in it. I could use square tubing and push in the corners or push in the sides. I could use prongs. I could make a trough and put a lot of them in it and close that. I could make slits and tabs in a piece of tubing, or I could just close the tubing in. I could use cloisonne wire. Cloisonne wire is really thin and really short, and fine silver, which is a plus because the rest of them aren't. So after that, the next thing I need to do is to measure my tubing and see where I am with that, see what tubing I have. Even when the tubing says that it's something, a lot of times it's not that close. Their specs are not as close as I need them to be. And then also for the square tubing, I ended up having to drill it out a little bit. It was almost the right size, but not quite. So I ended up having to drill it out. I have a little video to show you, which I'm going to show you next. What I'd like to talk to you about a little bit today is calipers and how to measure things. So calipers come in 2 main flavors, and that is digital and dial. Dial ones are really nice if you're doing comparisons of lots of parts because it's really easy to see where the needle is. But for the most part, what we want to do is we want to measure one or two things. We want to know really accurately what they are. So digital works really well for us. Digital also works well for us because it has a feature where I can change with the touch of a button. I can change from inch to millimeter. And since so many of the parts we work with are all over the place, as far as some are in inches, some are in millimeters, and so it's really nice to be able to switch back and forth easily. So the first thing that I want to do is to be sure that my calipers are zeroed out. So when I turn them on, they usually read 0. But what I want to do is open them up. I want to clean the inside of the jaws right here real well. I'll make sure they're clean. Close it back up and make sure it reads 0, and it does not. So if it doesn't read 0, I want to come down here and zero it out so that I'm sure that I'm starting at 0. That's important. The next thing I want to do is I'm going to show you how to measure. So this is a piece of tubing that I have, and I want to know what size it is. So I can measure the outside diameter of the tube by taking it and putting it either in here, right here. So it's 162 thousandths of an inch, or it's just over 4 millimeters on the outside. Okay, and I can also go up further. It's a little easier sometimes if I go up further right there. Same thing, same measurement. Okay. Now, the jaws get really narrow here. See how skinny they are there? And one of the things that buys me is that I could measure the wall thickness of this tubing also. So if I take that skinny part and I put it just barely in there like that, it tells me that it's 1/2 millimeter thick. And if I want to know that in inches, it's 20 thousandths of an inch. So then, and you have to be a little bit careful here because you want to be sure there's not a burr on the outside of your tube. You might want to measure in several places to be sure. This one measures 21 thousandths, and now I'm measuring 20.5, and now I'm measuring 20. So it's really close to 20. 21, 21, okay? So if I want to measure, let's say now I want to measure the inside diameter across here. The way I do that is by using the top part up here of the calipers. And I put those in here and pull and kind of turn this, make sure I'm in the middle. So that shows me I'm at 121 thousandths of an inch. Now, I want it in millimeters because I'm going to see if this is the size I need for my stone. So it's just over 3 millimeters. So that's going to be perfect for the stone I want to set. Okay? And again, I can do it in several places. I push it together, pull it apart, make sure it's in a good place. It's just over 3 millimeters. That's good. So that tells me that that tubing is going to work for the stones that I want to set. Now, when I'm measuring something like a pearl, let's say, I don't really want to use the skinny part here because it's really difficult for me to tell where the middle of that pearl is. I'm very likely to be off. So I'm much better off if I measure up here a little bit where it's bigger. The jaws are a little bit bigger, and I'm pretty confident that I can grab the middle of that pearl. So 694, 694, 694. I'm turning the pearl each time. 694, this is a very round pearl. 695, 694, 694. I'd say that's really close to 7 millimeters. I want to show you measuring a little faceted stone. So when I do a faceted stone, I turn it over on my finger like that, table side down. So it's on my finger, table side down. I don't try to use this narrow part. I go way up here to the thicker part, and I close down on the stone. That says 302. I'm going to put it down. I'm going to turn and measure another part, 303. I'm going to put it down. I'm going to turn. I'm going to measure again, 303. Put it down, turn, measure again, 3. Now, that doesn't mean that it's necessarily off that much. What it likely means is that I got the stone in a little bit crooked. So what I do, and that's one reason I take a lot of measurements, is because then I would say this one is just over 3 millimeters. Okay. So these calipers are fancy ones, and they'll turn themselves off after a little while. If you have the Harbor Freight ones, those are perfectly good calipers. They're great calipers, but you need to remember to turn them off or you're going to eat batteries something fierce. So that's just a reminder for you. The last thing that I want to show you is that on the caliper, There's one other thing you can measure. It's down here on this far end right here. And that is that as I move this, if you watch that far end, look at that thing coming out. See that? That will measure the inside of holes if I want to know how deep something is. Now it only does it if whatever you're measuring is at least that wide. So for us, sometimes that's an issue. But it will measure inside of things that you can't get to easily any other way. So these are 6-inch calipers. You can get 4-inch calipers from Harbor Freight. I like the digital ones, and they give you a lot of information. They're really good to know how to do stuff. Everybody should have these in their studio. So that's how to use calipers. Questions on that, on using your calipers? All right. So now you know how to measure your stones and you know how to measure your tubing. So we're going to go back to the photos. And we're going to talk about possibilities. So this is one possibility for setting stones. These are pre-made prong settings for cabochons. And the way that you can tell that for cabochons is, remember that when you set a stone, what's critical is the seat. If the stone doesn't seat well, you're in trouble from the beginning. It has to seat well. So if you look at these, it's got a flat seat across here. Can you see it's got a flat seat right there? That's where the stone is supposed to sit. It sits on that, and then the prongs come up and close over it. These are commercially available in lots and lots of sizes. Rio sells some. Trips sells a lot of them. It's TRIPPS. And you can get them other places. But prong setting is a real possibility. And for these tiny ones, it's really nice because you just plop them in and push the prongs over and you're pretty much done. This is a bad slide, but I wanted to show it to you close up. Remember, this is 3 millimeters. I couldn't get any better taking a tiny one. So this is a pre-made bezel cup. And what I wanted to show you on this is a couple of things. One is I had to file it way down because remember, this stone is only 1 millimeter tall. So this now is about a 1/2 millimeter. But look at the bezel cup. The bezel cup, anytime you use bezel cups, you know how I hate bezel cups. It's got this rounded bottom on it. So it doesn't have a nice solder fillet here. It always looks like it's about to come off, whether it is or not. This was another alternative that I did. Another alternative was that I made well, first of all, I tried to use a commercial cloisonne wire, but commercial cloisonne wire is so thin. So what I did was to take some 24 gauge fine silver wire and put it through the mill until it was 28 gauge flat. And then I made bezels out of that. I actually made them, and I'll talk to you about how to do that in a little bit. The one thing I do want to point out to you is the scribe here. So what I did was to be sure to make them a little bit small and put them on the scribe and then roll them until they stretched a little bit, till they fit the stone. So this is again the bezel cup, and you can see this rounded bottom that I do not like, but it's filed down. This is a piece of square tubing that I thought I would try. I did a couple of those. So one of the things that I have to do is, after I have soldered all of these on, I soldered on square tube, round tube from 2 different sources, the cloisonne wire. I soldered all that onto scrap sheet. But then what I had to do was to clean up inside the bezel, and cleaning up inside a 3 millimeter bezel is really hard. So what this is it's called a pin polisher, and these are available at Rio. They come in 2 millimeter size and 3 millimeter size. And what I would do is to just put this in. So you can, these are replaceable ends right here, and they come in different grits. And what I did was to just put it on a file until it was nice and flat, and then I could go around the interior of the bezel and clean it up prior to setting the stone. And this is the Rio. This is the 2 millimeter one. They also have a 3 millimeter one. So this is the first one that I set, and I thought that I would play around. I mean, why not push it? I'm not going to use these for anything. They're just samples. I decided I would push it and see what I could learn. So this is square tubing, and that is the stone in there. That's one reason these stones are not the best. They're really pale, so they're kind of hard to see. But what I did was to push in the sides on this one. And that stone is captured and it's in there actually quite well. At this time I wasn't cutting the tube off as short as I should. It should have been shorter than this. But one of my problems is I don't know that I could have gotten it to turn over. See how thick this is? So I don't know that I could have gotten it to shove over the stone. I think I would have had to thin out the top in order to get that to set. The one thing I did have to do with the square tube is the square tube was just a little bit too small on the inside to have the stone sit down. And what I ended up having to do was to take a number 30 drill bit and to drill it out just ever so slightly so that the stone would go in there. This is how I set it. I just used a corner of the bezel setter, and I used, so for a lot of you, I have the larger bezel pusher that I like a lot. This was the tiny one because if I don't use a tiny one, I was going to hit the bottom and everything else. That's my thumb. You can see how tiny this thing is. So this is the second one that I did right here. And this is a square tube where I shoved the sides in. This was very difficult to do. It was almost impossible to do. I got it to sit down. I got it in there. It's not pretty. You probably could make it prettier if you hammer set it, if I went in and hammer set it. But again, then I would make it much, much shorter. This one is a bezel cup, and it has the same problem as any bezel cup. I was hoping that by being so tiny, I could get it to compress down nicely. Nope. This is a bezel cup I haven't set yet. And look, this is one of the problems I have with it. If you look here and here, those are marks in it from making the bezel cup, from when they die strike it, when they push it down into the form. And so I did end up sanding that off a lot or filing it off. But even so, it was very difficult to get this looking nice. This is a side view of both of the bezel cup and the square tube. And you can see how tall that square tube is. It's way too tall. It's about 1 millimeter high. So this is, I believe, the tubing, one of the tubing ones. So I decided I had to file it down way short. You can see the stone sticking up right there. I went way short with this one. But see how thick that tube is? And it's sterling. So I pushed on it and 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 finally got it to where it would hold the stone in. Again, not easy to set. So this one is actually set in there. And then I tried a second one that I think I couldn't get. This is when I made the cloisonné wire. So I call it cloisonné wire. Really, it's just fine silver wire. Like I said, it was 24 gauge round wire. I put it through the mill and made it 28 gauge thickness. Now, one of the issues that you have with this is that is so tiny and my hands are big and I don't really do well with fitting that around a stone, and fitting that's going to be a nightmare. So I didn't do it. What I did was that I knew that my stones were 3 millimeters. So I did 3 millimeters times pi, 3.14, came out with 9.42 millimeters. So I cut some 10 millimeter little pieces, and it turns out they are just about the right size, the right length, a little bit small. So when they come out and they're a little bit small, what I did was to put them on that mandrel that I showed you earlier. And then I pushed really hard on an anvil and rolled it. And what that does is that stretches it enough that it fit the stone just fine. Now, I formed them around and soldered them shut. So I had to solder them shut with hard solder and then solder them onto a sheet. This is, I believe, the tubing again. Yes. No, this is the cloisonné wire. I'm going to go back. So this is the first one that I set, and it was way too tall, and I couldn't get it to shove over. This one I filed down a whole lot. So you can see how thick that is? That's 28 gauge. So that tells you a little bit about how close up this is.
This is fine silver, Deb?
This was fine silver. All the rest are sterling. This one is fine silver. So this is the tubing from Monster Slayer, and it's a little bit thicker then the Rio tube. And you can see I marked on the back of these. I do have to tell you, I had 3 of these set. Now I've only got 1 in there now. I had 3 of them set, and then I decided I was going to touch them up by using the tube setters. I mean, that sounds like a great idea, doesn't it? I shattered every one of them that I touched with the tube setter. So one of the things with the tube setter is that they're often too flat for cabochons. They're really designed for faceted stone. Well, they're really designed for setting faceted prongs, but you can use them for doing like tube settings of faceted stones, but doing cabochons, not so much. I shattered every last one of them. This is the square and the bezel cup, which did not come out beautiful. And this was the cloisonne wire, which actually the super short one, this was 0.5 millimeter, came out pretty darn nice. This is all of them together. So you can see, this is the nicest one right here, the cloisonne wire. And this tube is a close second. And that's the thinner of the tubes. That's the Rio tube. It's a little bit thinner than the Monster Slayer tube.
Is that thick walled tubing or regular walled tubing?
Oh, just regular. Thick wall would, there's no way I would have said it. Yeah, all of this is just regular. So you can see these are super, I mean, this is my bench pin across here, right? These are super, super blown up. All right. All right. So some conclusions, overall conclusions here we're going to talk about. It was interesting to experiment with it. And I think that if I did the square tube again, I would think about holding on to it and filing the top at an angle so that the top is very, very, very thin. Plus it can only be about 0.5 millimeter tall on these stones. Now some stones, even if they're really tiny, you might be able to go taller, but right now you can't do that. That's just not going to work. So you need to look at your stones and see what it is that you need to do. Okay. So overall conclusion, making the cloisonne wire was the best way to go, believe it or not. It was just what needed to happen. So I made my own cloisonne wire. I figured out the length rather than trying to fit it to the bezel or fit it to the stone, because fitting it to the stone is going to be a nightmare. So I just measured the overall length and soldered it shut with the hard solder, soldered it onto something. So it's harder to make with the cloisonne wire, but it was by far the prettiest, by far the easiest to set. And the tube was okay. It was much harder to set, but it also was pretty. It looks pretty when it's done. It looks okay. Bezel cup, no way. They were a mess. They were worse than the big ones. Square.
Deb,
Yeah.
the cloisonne wire is the fine silver that you went from 24 to 28, right? Okay, just making sure. Okay, thanks.
The square tube, I think, has possibilities, and I think that you could make it look nice if you played around with it enough. It definitely has possibilities. The big conclusion is that working with stones is just a pain. It's a pain in the butt. I would do it, number one, only if I had a stone that made it worth it. So in other words, these rose quartz, you can't even see them. And when I get them set in there, they just look like there's nothing there. So what I think you need to do is use a stone with a lot of color, a bright color, a beautiful stone. So in other words, if I'm going to put a little ruby somewhere or something like that, that might be worth my time and effort to do that. But if I'm going to use just a little ordinary stone because it was cheap, because I have it, I probably wouldn't mess with it. So basically for me, what I found is that you got to make the stone worth the time and the trouble and the effort. And if you do, go ahead and make the cloisonne wire, go ahead and figure out the length and then put it on there. And they can be really pretty.
Hey, Deb.
Yeah.
What if you used the bezel cup and cut the center out of it so that it was more flat?
Well, it'd be flat, but you still can't shove it over. Bezel cups are Very, very, very thin, number one. So they're about 30 gauge. They usually have manufacturing defects on the sides, like the one I pointed out to you. And they are sterling. So they're very, very hard to shove over. Plus, being 30 gauge, there's no room for mistake. If you shove it over and you get a little bit of a crease in there or something like that, then what happens is that becomes either either a fold, or it becomes, as you clean it up, you'll go through it and break through the bezel. So regardless of how you handle that, it's a mess. Bezel cups are just not, they're not worth the effort. They're just not.
Hey, Deb, I've one comment, two questions, having done this a lot. I have drilled out bezel cup centers and had moderate luck with it. I've used the Harbor Freight little mandrel things and have measured my stone and found one close enough to wrap bezel wire around that as a mandrel. And my question is, how do you know with a cheapy rolling mill how you get to roll it down to the correct millimeter for the cloisonne wire? How do you know where you are, or how
for height?
No, to make it 28 gauge.
Oh, you just stop and measure occasionally. So from 24 to 28 on fine silver wire, it takes almost nothing. So what I did was to start with just a short piece of wire and do several passes until I figured out exactly where 28 gauge is, and it doesn't take much at all. And then I took a long piece and just rolled the whole thing through.
Does it make it wider?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Mine is, let me measure it real quick. Mine
So
is.
then you'd have to start over to get the right width, right? I mean, then
You got to figure out the right width. So this one is about 1 millimeter wide right now. That's what it came to. Okay. But that's too big. But at the same time, I couldn't handle the 0.5 millimeter. So 0.5 millimeter is what I needed to end up with. But the 0.5 millimeter was so tiny that I just couldn't even deal with it. So I started with the millimeter tall one. And then what I did was to form it, solder it shut with hard solder, solder it down, and then I filed it off until it was the right height, because I couldn't work with it any other way. It's fine silver, it's too little, it was just too hard.
okay, thanks.
So Deb, I have a question along those lines. When you file down the top of the 28 gauge wire, how do you prevent it from moving in and out?
By using a really fine file, and by not having it too terribly tall in the first place. So I use the Barrett number 4 cut file on it. And normally I would use a bigger file, but that file is wide enough on a 3 millimeter. It's 3 millimeters wide, so I could file the whole thing at once. And so I just went across it. But by using a really fine file gently, I could just work it down until it was the right height. It's also really short. You know, if the bezel is really tall, if I used one of the standard Rio bezels or something that's say 2 or 3 millimeters high, if I used one of the standard bezel that's 2 or 3 millimeters high, it would be much more likely to fall over than if I used the short one, the 1 millimeter. Any other questions?
So why is it that, I mean, maybe you just don't have it, but getting bezel wire that's 20 or 30 gauge and just having, you know, they sell it at all different heights. And
They don't sell it this little.
So is it the tiniest cloisonne wire you're doing?
No. And actually this isn't cloisonne wire because I made it. The cloisonne wire that I have is even thinner than this. It's probably 30 gauge. This is 28 gauge. And I'll tell you how tall it is in just a second. See, I have my little calipers. And I'm going to make them read in millimeters, and I'm going to measure across my wire. 1.07 millimeters. So I'm pretty close to a millimeter. So it's still much taller than I needed it to be, but the true cloisonne wire that I had was probably 3/4 of a millimeter high and thin, 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 thin. And I found that I couldn't handle it very well, number one. When I did handle it and make it into something, I was much more likely to melt it. This did really well for me. It really wasn't as hard as I thought it was going to be. It was time consuming, but wasn't real difficult.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Deb?
Yeah.
If you had the square tubing and you filed all your corners off a little bit and then you pushed over the sides, would that work?
Sure. I mean, I would try different things with it. I think one of the issues with these tiny stones is that even the thin wall tube is pretty darn thick. Remember that tube that I measured? That's one that I used. That's a 1/2 millimeter thick. So you're talking about a 1/2 millimeter all the way around, 1/2 millimeter thick and a 1/2 millimeter tall. That's hard to set.
Yeah.
It just is. There's not much there. You can't get a lot of leverage on it. You can't get a lot of anything else. So that makes it really tough. You could probably hammer set it, but again, the stones are so tiny. It's really hard to deal with. So you can do more experimenting with it and more playing with it. But I really, if I had to do it in my work, I would definitely do the fine silver wire, put it through the mill until it was the right gauge, and then make the bezels. Now, that being said, if I was doing production work, something where I'm selling and I need to do 30 of these, I don't know that I would do that. I would probably figure out a design with the prong settings that are, I can plop it in, push the prongs over, and walk away.
Would you ever try to build up the inside of the bezel?
Build up the inside. Oh,
You know how they put a jump ring on the inside to.
Sure, you could do that. Make the stone, make it taller.
Yeah.
Yeah, you still have the issue of making it tiny. I mean, you still have to make a 3 millimeter bezel, right?
Yeah.
And making a 3 millimeter bezel in a really thicker wire is significantly more difficult. This was not hard to do. It was a little bit time consuming, and it was more time consuming just to figure it out. But doing it was not that horrible. It was plenty doable.
So could you possibly do like a volcano setting for a tiny stone?
Oh, sure. You could do a volcano setting. Another one that you could do is that I didn't do and I meant to do, but I broke all my stones, was if you take the tubing and then you use a separating disc and you make slits in it so that you push the slits over. That's a lot easier than trying to shove the tube over. I've already done that and I've shown most of you that in the past, so I didn't do it for this one because I wanted to see if I could shove that stone or shove the tubing over. And I was able to do it, but not beautifully.
If you did the slits, could you actually take out part of it? I mean, like, oh, okay.
Sure, where you basically use it like a little prong, like little prongs. Yeah, you could do that.
Okay, what's a volcano setting?
Oh, that's where you have basically 2 sheets of metal. The top sheet has a hole in it that the stone won't go through, but you put a hole in it and then it's shaped up a little bit so that it fits over the stone, locks it in place, and it's got a bottom sheet that holds it in place, or you can do bottom prongs underneath that hold it in place. Either one. But now we're talking I mean, the hole is easy, but doing something underneath, if you're going to, rivet it or something like that, that's great. But if you're going to try to do prongs that you're going to solder on in the 3 millimeter thing, I don't know. Good luck. I mean, it's doable. It's just really hard. Working that tiny has its challenges. Anybody else?
What about gypsy settings?
You can do that. The problem is, at least for me, so basically what you would do with a gypsy setting is that you have a mass of metal. It's kind of like a flush set, but for a cabochon. You have a mass of metal, and what you're going to do is that you're going to take and use a stone burr, cut down in so that your stone is down in there. Then you're going to hammer around the outside until you push that metal over. And I don't know. I mean, I think it's plenty doable, but it's not an easy thing to do. And especially this tiny, I don't think it's easy to do.
Hi, Deb. I was looking on Rio about the cloisonne wires, and it says you can get fine silver strip that's 28 gauge. Could you use that instead of rolling yours down?
Man.
How tall?
Let's see what it says, how tall. It doesn't really say, it just says strip. It probably says somewhere in here, but I'm not.
If it's tall enough, yeah, you could, absolutely. And that's fine silver, and it's that would be great. I didn't have it. Mine was thinner than that. Mine was 30.
Yeah, they do. Yeah, they sell the 30 too, but I just happened to find this because I looked specifically for 28 gauge. Since for me, it's hard to roll stuff down.
Yeah, so if they have 28 gauge, that's great. Then you don't have to make it.
Hey, Deb, could you use stitches? You know how you make those stitches in the back plate? Would it hold the stone if you made enough stitches?
Maybe if your stone was flat enough.
Uh-huh.
Maybe, I don't know. I think that's going to be a little bit tough. Depends on the shape of your cabochon, right? Because if you have a really tall cabochon, absolutely not. Mine were really flat. Mine were really little, so short as well as little. But I don't know that they even would hold mine, because the edges kind of came up straight and then it curved over. It was kind of flat on the top. So my stitches would have to be so big. I don't know. That would be. It would depend on the shape of your cab. If your cab is flat enough, you could get away with it.
Okay, what's a stitch setting?
So
what are stitches first?
Yeah, actually, if you so if you took a thick piece of metal and you used a stone burr, you cut a hole in it first, then used a stone burr so the stone was sunken down in, then you could use the stitches. Now I'll back up and tell you what that is. So what the stitches are is when you take a graver and you take a piece of sheet metal, you dig the graver in, and what it'll do is to cut up a curl of metal that'll go over that acts like a prong. So if you took the tiny stone, the 3 millimeter stone, and you set it below grade so that your metal has to be really thick, and you burred it out, then you probably could raise a stitch and make that set.
Is that the same as bead setting?
So bead setting, sort of. Bead setting, typically what we do is to do that, and then you have something to turn that in rather than looking like a prong. You have a little tool that takes and compresses that into a rounded thing. So it looks like a bead, right? Similar. Close. Yes. All of those are going to require really hard stones, or you're going to be in trouble. Any questions?
Yeah, I have one more on that. Deb, that gives all kinds of different millimeters. And if it's 28 gauge, it says something like, it has all different things, but it says like 1/4 by 0.016 or 6.35 by 0.41 millimeters. So where's so the 6.35 would be the height,
Kelly,
right?
I have to go through and do all the numbers and do all the figuring. I have no idea.
Okay, me either.
I have to go through and figure it out each time. You can always ask Google, tell it it's this many inches, how many millimeters is that? And it'll tell you.
Okay.
Google works really well. So do your calipers.
Okay.
That's one thing I do with the calipers, is that when Rio tells me that something is 174 thousandths, I measure that out on my calipers and I push the millimeter thing and make it tell me in millimeters. One of the problems we have is that we measure things in so many different ways. And it's like gold square wire comes in millimeters and round wire comes in gauge. And yeah, and in silver, square wire comes by the number 1 through 5 or 1 through 7, which has nothing to do with anything to do with gauge. Well, some of it does, the rectangular one, but the square, the square is gauge, the rectangular is number. I don't know. So we have so many different ones that we're dealing with. It makes it really hard to figure out what's what. And Rio is not good about telling us the different numbers. They tell us one set of numbers and that's it. And their numbers are sometimes not so good. I'm pretty convinced that their Kambu numbers are wrong. that they slipped a decimal point somewhere. But that's why I want my calipers, and I want to measure. And especially when I'm doing things with these tubes and stuff like that, I need to measure these. I need to see if it's really, so when they say 3 millimeter inside, does that mean that it's really 3 millimeters, or is it over 3 millimeters, or is it under 3 millimeters? Because if it's slightly over or exactly 3 millimeters, I can probably find a stone to fit it. If it's under 3 millimeters, I'm going to have problems. And I'm not going to know that until I get the tube in my hand, because what Rio says it is and what it really is may not be the same. And that's not just Rio, that's everybody. That's just standard. So you need to measure it. You need the calipers, you need to measure, and you need to measure your stones to be sure that everything's going to match up.
Let me just ask real quick, you consistently measured the bezel wire when you rolled it down to 10 millimeters and it fit all the 3 millimeter stones pretty well? Is that what you said? The times pi, 3 millimeters times pi, and you cut.
Oh, that wasn't about rolling it down. That was about cutting off pieces.
No, when you cut it off, that's what I meant.
Oh,
So the length of it was pretty consistently worked, or sometimes you stretched it on the,
So it's actually, that's a really good question, Wendy. So what I did was to make 2 sets. The first set I made, because it's so thin, so the measurement came out, it was 3 millimeter stone. Let me turn it around and see my measurements. 3 millimeter stone times 3.14, which came out to 9.42 millimeters. So I made it 9.5 millimeters for the first set. And they were way too small. They were absolutely too small. I couldn't even stretch them to be big enough. So then I made a set that was 10 millimeters. And they even needed to be stretched a little bit to fit. I did not do any filing on the ends. It's so thin and so tiny. I just cut the pieces. I did use flush cutters. I was really careful to do a good flush cut on them. I used the flush cutters, and then I had a pair of pliers, but using one of the Harbor Freight mandrels too would work great. Matter of fact, that would have been a better choice. So, and then you just wrap it around there. I tried to keep it as round as possible, but it gets a little bit flat on the area where I'm joining it. I soldered them shut with hard solder, and then I went and made them perfectly round, and they fit pretty well.
thanks.
Yeah, so I had to add more than I thought I would, but not a bunch. I mean, I had to add a 0.5 millimeter. So.
Deb,
Yeah.
can you put these things in a regular tube setting?
No, I'm glad you asked that. So, sorta. So the regular tube settings are designed for faceted stones. So what you have to do is that you have to drill it out even further, number one. So you have to take a burr of the right size, and you have to get in there, and you have to make the seat lower down. When you do that, the seat is slanted, and the seat on a cabochon really should be flat. So that's one issue, is that it makes it fit a little bit funny, and sometimes the stone doesn't seat as well as it should. If you have a cylinder burr or something that is the right size that's flat on the bottom, you can get down in there and do that with it, but that's not easy to do either. And then you have the issue of setting it. You can't use a tube setter. So you're dealing with the sterling tubes again. They're sterling silver, and you've got to get that to go over the stone. Now it's a little bit thinner, and it can go okay, but it's not the easiest. I don't think it buys you anything from regular tubing. It might. It's a little bit thinner, but not much.
They make fine silver tubing.
Yeah, you could use fine silver tubing if you size it right. I did not have any that was the right size, and I have a lot of fine silver tubing. I had nothing that was the right size. Fine silver tubing would be a little bit easier to shove over, but I don't know that it would be easier enough. It'd be worth a try.
Would it be too hard to make little tab settings?
No, that'd be easy. It's what I meant to do, like I said, but I broke too many stones. So all you would do with that is so the one thing that's hard about it is I'm dealing with a 0.5 millimeter tall piece, and I want to cut tabs in that. So there's almost no room to cut anything, right? I mean, a 0.5 millimeter is tiny. I could barely even see how tall the thing is. I felt like I was gonna file it away entirely.
Well, I meant like drill, like if you have a 3mm cab, drill like a, I don't know, 1mm hole in the back plate and cut like a star-shaped pattern and then punch those little guys up.
Oh, you could do that. Yeah. Yeah, so you punch up every other one and it sits on the other ones.
Something like that, yeah. I don't
Yeah.
know.
Yeah, that would work.
I
But
can
it's
tell
tiny.
how much you loved setting these little stones.
I gotta say, if I had a really beautiful stone, if I had a ruby or a sapphire or a diamond cab, you know, something like that, something that would really show. I'd actually rather have the ruby or the sapphire. But if I had a cab that was tiny that would really show, I would definitely go through and do the cloisonne wire and do it again. But if I'm glad that I don't have these rose quartz anymore, and I did not love setting them. I did learn a lot in setting them, and I think I got a lot of valuable information as far, and that's one of the things that I wanted to kind of stress is that sometimes when we do these, even if you end up saying, did that, not going to do that again, that often we learn a lot from that. And I did learn a lot from setting these. I learned a lot about the tubing and ways to handle it and ways to handle little stones and what I would do again. I'm not nearly as fearful or nervous about using tiny stones. I would do it in a heartbeat, but now I know how to do it and I know what to do. And that's why I wanted to share that with you. Anything else?
Thank you. Thank you.
You're welcome. All right. Thank you for joining me for Studio Time with Deb, the online version, and I will see you next week.